So the last time we met, we began our study of Buddhism, and we learned that Buddhism originated in India, but then it gradually dies out there and thrives to the east. So we find the greatest concentration of Buddhists in East Asia and Southeast Asia. And there are a variety of different sectarian branches of the Buddhist religion. And today and Monday and Wednesday, we're going to look at 3 different branches of Buddhism. And we'll begin today by talking about Theravada Buddhism, which is the oldest sectarian branch of Buddhism. It's generally understood to be the most conservative, the most traditional of the different branches of Buddhism. And we'll see how different it is from the other forms of Buddhism we'll explore next week. In preparation for our discussion of Mahayana Buddhism on Monday, as I state in the syllabus, I'd like you to read a document called How to Meditate Zazen. So Zazen is a particular Buddhist meditation technique, and the reading just describes how someone does Zazen, what kind of position you're supposed to place your body, how you breathe, all those different components to this meditative exercise. And Zazen is the centerpiece of the Zen tradition of Buddhism. So Zen Buddhism is a denomination or school of Mahayana Buddhism, one of the most popular in the world. In China, it's called Chan Buddhism, but we know it by its Japanese name, which is Zen. So we'll learn about Zen in addition to Jodo or Pure Land Buddhism on Monday. But today our subject is Theravada. So I'd like to begin the lecture today by showing you this map. And here we have this B in a circle. This is the birthplace of Buddhism. This is the region of India where the Buddha is said to have taught and where he was enlightened, right? We learned that traditional story last time that he sits beneath that tree, the Bodhi tree, and he defeats Mara, the Lord of illusion and ignorance, and achieves nirvana. And thereafter, he goes to Sarnath, where he gives his first sermon, the wheel-turning sermon, to the 5 ascetics who had abandoned him after he had arrived at that insight that the middle path was the true path to liberation. And he then articulates these distinctive ideas that set Buddhism apart from Hinduism. Right? The Buddha, for example, denies the existence of the Atman. He articulates this doctrine of anatman, of no self. And he focuses on this path of ascetic discipline, right? Of disciplining the mind, of clarifying one's thoughts, as opposed to what we saw in Hinduism, where you have rituals to different gods and goddesses, and you have the caste system and all those sorts of things. So Buddhism offers a completely different approach, a different method, a different path for human beings to achieve liberation from samsara. We learned about samsara in our study of Hinduism. That's the eternal cycle of time, and your karma dictates the conditions of your reincarnations. All of that is still at play here in Buddhism, but the Buddha teaches a completely different understanding for how human beings achieve liberation from samsara. And as we'll see in the ensuing centuries, new ideas come in, new interpretations come in, and Buddhism becomes quite diverse in its beliefs and practices. So for today, I asked you to read a document that was the excerpts from the Dhammapada. And the Dhammapada is a collection of sayings attributed to the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. And they are found in a text known as the Tripitaka, also called the Tipitaka in Pali, or simply as the Pali Canon. The Tripitaka, and that's the Sanskrit version of the name, is our oldest surviving collection of Buddhist texts. It's the oldest surviving Buddhist canon. And it comes to us from around the 1st century BCE. Now remember, as we discussed last time, the Buddha himself lived in either the 6th century BCE or the 5th century BCE. And here we have the oldest text, which is written in the 1st century BCE. So his teachings, like the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, his his understanding of impermanence and anatman and so forth. Those things were all passed on through oral tradition for centuries before they get written down. And the principal transmitters of those teachings were members of the Sangha. So I introduced you to that term last time. The Sangha refers to the monastic community. So the monks and nuns who live according to the Buddha's teachings in their quest for liberation or nirvana, liberation from samsara. So they pass on his teachings for generations through oral tradition. Now, there are some monuments that date, for example, from the 3rd or 4th century BCE that have some teachings of the Buddha, but hardly a comprehensive body of literature, right? Just simple inscriptions on monuments, such as the Four Noble Truths. But it's not until we get to the Tripitaka, which, as I said, contains the Dhammapada, that collection of sayings that I had you read for today, do we have an actual authoritative collection of Buddhist texts. Well, why was it finally written in the 1st century? Well, we're told that the Buddhist community, the Sangha, that existed on the island of Sri Lanka, and I had you find Sri Lanka on your map assignment, was faced with a famine. So the people who had memorized the teachings of the Buddha, right, were these living repositories of the Dharma, of Buddhist knowledge, were dying off. And so amidst that very difficult situation, there was new urgency to, oh my gosh, we need to write this stuff down to preserve it. Because if everyone dies off, the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha will be lost. So they write it down. And paper, of course, hadn't been invented yet. So people are either writing on things like animal hide or palm leaves. And in this case, they write on palm leaves. So it's not exactly a book in the recognizable sense. Later, it gets transformed into formal books, and that's how we would see it today. Why is it called the Tripitaka? Well, the literal meaning of Tripitaka in Sanskrit is 3 baskets. Why is a Buddhist text called the 3 baskets? Well, the story goes that as the monks were writing down all the knowledge they had memorized and received down through the generations, they then sorted these palm leaves that they wrote on according to topic. And they sorted them using 3 baskets. So in one basket, they put all the sutras, that is the sermons of the Buddha. In another basket, they put all the knowledge related to living a monastic life, all the rules you have to follow. In the Theravada tradition, there's over 200 rules that a monk has to live by in order to pursue nirvana. That's called the Vinaya. And then the third basket, that's where they toss basically everything else. That's the kind of the speculative section where you have all these philosophical speculations about the nature of reality, sort of a general body of wisdom literature to go with the other 2. Now, here you can see what the original palm leaf looked like, right? Not a book in the traditional sense, but if you were to find a modern printed edition, it would look something like this. And so it's a massive collection. It's an anthology of writings, the various sermons and discussions of monastic life and rules and resolving issues and problems within the community. That's all contained there. So if the Tripitaka, the oldest written collection of Buddhist teachings, was composed in Sri Lanka, not in India, right? This is Sri Lanka here, but the Buddha lived and taught up here. Why did it happen down here? How did Buddhism get down here? Well, that was a result of a particular king or emperor. In the 4th century BCE, an empire took shape throughout the Indian subcontinent. And this was really the first kingdom or empire to rule over basically the entirety of the Indian subcontinent, thus creating a kind of unified India in the way that we think of it today. Now, originally, the Mauryan Empire was a Hindu empire. But then during the reign of the 3rd emperor in this royal dynasty, his name was Ashoka. He lived in the 3rd century BCE. Ashoka had been a great emperor, a great conqueror, leader of armies, and he had vanquished his foes and expanded territory, all the things that a powerful, mighty emperor might do. But then he had a personal transformation, and he encountered this still relatively young religious movement that we know today as Buddhism, and he joined them. He converts to Buddhism, and this changes his whole outlook on things. So the conversion of this Hindu emperor Ashoka to Buddhism is this momentous event in the history of Buddhism. It is comparable to the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine to Christianity. Right? It's Constantine who is the first in the 4th century to legalize Christianity in the Roman Empire, and so it moves from being a persecuted minority religion to eventually being the state religion of the Roman Empire by the end of the 4th century. This is something quite similar. Right? We have this, this sort of dissident Shramana sect, this ascetic movement that's criticizing the caste system and the authorities of the Brahmins and rejecting the Vedas and the sacrifices to the different gods. And it may have just sort of dissipated in time, been reabsorbed by Hinduism. But instead, here comes Ashoka, he converts to it, and now you have all the resources of this empire, all the wealth, the ability to build temples and shrines to Buddhism throughout the empire. And that's precisely what Ashoka does. He uses his wealth and his power and his influence to help develop Buddhism into the religion that we know today. And his son, Mahinda, joins him in becoming a Buddhist, and Mahinda decides that he's going to become a bhikkhu. A bhikkhu is a Buddhist monk. So he's someone who's going to live according to all of the rules that have existed within the Sangha since the time of the Buddha. And Ashoka sends Mahinda as a Buddhist missionary of sorts to the south. And he travels to the island of Sri Lanka. So Mahinda is credited with bringing Buddhism to the island of Sri Lanka, where he establishes a monastic community. So he establishes the Sangha in Sri Lanka, and it's that community that will later write down the Tripitaka. So that's how the Tripitaka came to be written in Sri Lanka and not in India. So with the support of the Emperor Ashoka, or King Ashoka, Buddhism begins to take a definitive form. Early on, you have kind of decentralized movement that hasn't formally been institutionalized the way Buddhism is today. But under Ashoka's patronage, and Constantine did the same thing with Christianity, right? He helps to sort of crystallize a definitive form of Christianity in the 4th century. We begin to see this recognizable sectarian articulation of Buddhism, which we know today as Theravada Buddhism. Now, the word Theravada means the way of the elders. So as indicated by the name of this sect, this form of Buddhism claims that they're following the old ways, the original ways, that they represent quote unquote orthodox Buddhism, traditional Buddhism, original Buddhism that can be traced all the way back to the original community and to the Buddha himself. So this form of Buddhism, despite its claims of legitimacy and its credentials going back to the earliest community, is not the most popular form of Buddhism in the world. And by the end of the lecture today, you'll see why, because it's quite rigorous, it's quite difficult, in contrast to the form of Buddhism we'll learn about on Monday, which is Mahayana Buddhism, which is much more flexible, much more readily adapts to modern life and circumstances. You'll understand why that's the most popular form of Buddhism on Monday. So one of the really restrictive, rigorous things about Theravada Buddhism is that it emphasizes that the only way a human being can hope to achieve liberation from samsara, the only way a human being can achieve nirvana is by becoming a monk and living according to all those rules and regulations. So right from the start, how many people actually want to go and live the rigorous life of a monk, right? Live a celibate life where you shave your head and wear these simple robes and don't have any property, don't have any possessions other than like a begging bowl, and just devote your entire life to the study of Buddhist texts and meditation and following all the rules of the Vinaya, things like you can't eat anything after noon every day, all these types of things. Already you can imagine that that's not going to appeal to everyone. So in emphasizing monastic life, Theravada Buddhists really strive to emulate the historical Buddha. The Buddha himself had lived this way, and that's how he had achieved nirvana. So that's the example human beings should follow then. They should try to emulate the Buddha. He's not a deity, he's not a superhuman being who can intervene and save you the way, for example, in Hinduism, you have the bhakti tradition of worshiping deities like Vishnu, and then Vishnu, through divine grace, will liberate you from samsara. Instead, Theravada tradition says, no, don't turn to worshiping deities. Instead, emulate the example of the historical Buddha. And he did these things, and he taught these things to his followers, the first Sangha. And so if we want to achieve nirvana like the Buddha, like Siddhartha, we have to do the same thing. So it's Theravada Buddhists who put together the text called the Tripitaka. And the Tripitaka is the authoritative source of Buddhist knowledge of the Dharma, according to Theravada Buddhists. Now, next week, when we look at other forms of Buddhism, they're going to have new texts with new ideas and new beliefs and all these additional things that don't exist in Theravada Buddhism. So as I said, Theravada Buddhism is not the most popular form in the world, and this map shows us where Theravada Buddhism is the dominant religion. As you can see, this map does not include China. And we learned in my first lecture on Buddhism that about half the Buddhists in the world live in China. They're not Theravada Buddhists. They're Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhists. Same goes for Japan, same goes for Korea. The only places where Theravada Buddhism is dominant is Sri Lanka, where the Tripitaka was composed, where Mahinda was sent by Ashoka, and Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. Everywhere else in East Asia where Buddhism is the dominant religion, it's Mahayana. And principally that's because this is such a strict, narrow Buddhist path compared to other forms of Buddhism. So what's it like to live your life as a Buddhist monk? If you have a look at this image on the right, you'll notice that the monk is wearing this brightly colored saffron or orange or yellow robe. This is a color worn by monks, ascetics in the Hindu tradition as well. So this color is associated with asceticism, with monasticism throughout South Asia, whether it's Hindus or Buddhists, because this color is meant to symbolize the color of fire. And in South Asian traditions, you cremate the dead. So just as an ascetic renounces the world, renounces attachment to the world, it's as if you're dying to the world. So ascetics and monks in both Hinduism and Buddhism will wear robes that are saffron, yellow, orange, to symbolize the fires of the cremation pyre. Now, as Buddhism moves to other regions of the world and other cultures, you'll see monks wearing some different robes. For example, in a country like Japan, it would be common to see monks wearing black or gray or brown. But in South Asia, countries like Sri Lanka, Myanmar, you still see this traditional color used. So according to Theravada Buddhism, being a monk, that's the only way anyone can achieve nirvana. So if you have a job and a family, even if you're a moral person, you can't achieve nirvana. You know, you can't like squeeze in some meditation on the weekends and hope you're going to get to nirvana. It's impossible. So if you're not a monk, the only thing you can do is try to act correctly, build up good karma so that when you're reincarnated, when you're still stuck in samsara, maybe then you'll have the opportunity to be a monk and achieve liberation. Now, I want to add another limitation. So already Theravada says the only way human beings can achieve nirvana is by being a monk. Well, as it happened over the centuries, the female monastic order, the order of nuns or bhikkhunis, died out. So according to traditional Theravada Buddhists, we're going to revisit this idea in my last lecture. There are some modern reformists trying to revive it. But for about 1,000 years, there has been no female monastic order. So what does that mean? That means that only men can achieve liberation, since there's no monastic order for women. So if you're a Theravada Buddhist and you're female, there's no way for you to achieve nirvana. You can't become a nun. It has died out. So all you can do is hope for a future reincarnation where you're a man and you have the means and the opportunity to become a monk. So according to Theravada Buddhism then, not only do you have to be a member of a monastic order and live a righteous life as a monk, right? Just because you become a monk doesn't mean you're going to achieve nirvana. You still have to do it well, but you also have to be a man, because only men can become members of monastic orders. So there's a very small group of people who can ever hope to achieve nirvana according to Theravada teachings. Next week, when we talk about Mahayana, in that form of Buddhism, anyone can achieve nirvana, which is why that's the more popular form, right? It's not restrictive like this. So in addition to their traditional robes, monks have very few items that belong to them. So they have a few robes. They have a means to shave their heads. They have a begging bowl. So monks are supposed to live their lives devoted to the study of the Dharma and of the practice of the Vinaya of meditation and so forth. They do not, work the fields and grow their own food or tend to livestock. Instead, they live off of food that is donated to them by the laity. The word laity means the non-monks, everyone who's not ordained into a religious order. So we talk about lay people versus monks. The lay people, that's all the women and then all the men who aren't monks. They donate food. And so the monks receive those offerings of food in their begging bowls, and they accept whatever is given to them, and that's what they live off of. They don't produce their own food. Because of that tradition, monasteries, the place where the monks live, tend to be nearby a village. Because if the monastery is off in, let's say, a distant mountain someplace, there's no one to donate food. So there's a symbiotic relationship between the monasteries and villages, cities, towns, because the monks live off the donations of the non-monks, and then the non-monks, by giving food to the monasteries, are building up good karma with the belief that this helps them in their own spiritual progress. So they can't achieve nirvana, but they can improve their next reincarnation. Here's a couple of images of monks in these traditional orange saffron robes. And they have received donations, so they're sitting down for their meal. According to the Vinaya, monks are not allowed to eat after noon each day. So in the morning, they can have like a breakfast, and then they have a lunch, and then no more eating for the rest of the day. So this is understood to be a manifestation of the middle path, right? It's not eating and indulging all day, but it's also not fasting all day or living on 1 grain of rice, which is the story in the Buddha's life story, right? When he's a Shakyamuni, this extreme ascetic, he's living off of 1 grain of rice and so forth. So the middle path is you eat for the first half of the day, but not the second half. And you see also here that in addition to food items, that monks may receive basic household goods as well. So here you can see he's got some paper towel that has been offered. We all make messes. So if a monk is exceptional in his commitment to the Dharma, to the teachings of the Buddha, and progresses, the monk can hope to become what's called an arhat, a perfected being. That is an enlightened human being. The understanding being that a monk who has become an arhat will enter parinirvana, that is total liberation, total nirvana, when he dies. And that's the Theravada ideal. That's what everyone hopes to achieve. Right? So that you're a man to be able to become a monk, and then if you're an exceptional monk, you become an arhat, who is an enlightened saint and will enter parinirvana, escape samsara, escape suffering upon death. Now, because of the veneration of these enlightened monks, a tradition of relic veneration has centered around them. That when a monk who is believed to be an arhat, and this is something by popular acclamation, not through any official recognition, right? That people think, oh, this monk is exceptional. He's very clearly enlightened, so we accept him as an enlightened being. When he dies and he's cremated, there's bits of the body that remain. We talked about this in our discussion of Hinduism. That certain parts of the body, if you're not using a modern crematorium, which can reach intense temperatures, if you're burning people with just a stack of wood, certain dense parts of the body like the hip bone or human teeth require a much higher temperature to be incinerated than typical bone in the human body. So those surviving bits of an arhat, a tooth, a bit of bone, become these venerated relics, that they become these sacred objects, and they are enshrined in these burial mounds called stupas. Now, sometimes a stupa becomes more elaborate, particularly in East Asian Mahayana Buddhism. They begin to look more like towers, and when they look like towers, they're typically referred to as pagodas. There are some other regional names for these burial mounds as well. This is a stupa, for example. So contained within it would be the relic of an enlightened monk, or as the custom developed over the centuries, sometimes in lieu of an actual relic, it might be an object like robes that belonged to a monk, or it could even be Buddhist texts and some other objects as well. Here's some more examples of stupas, these burial mounds that contain the relic of an enlightened being. And I'm going to show you in a moment some stupas that are associated with the Buddha himself and his original followers. So the use of stupas goes back to ancient times, probably predates Buddhism, and was used in other religious contexts and practices in South Asia, but then it became adapted for Buddhist use as well. And when you visit a stupa, you are in the vicinity of a holy sacred object, which emanates good karma. And so the thinking is that if you go on pilgrimage and you visit these stupas, you are bringing good karma upon yourself. You're cleansing yourself and improving your future birth, maybe even improving the immediate conditions of your life, because you're suddenly in the vicinity of this positive, karmically positive environment. And the tradition is to walk, to circumambulate the stupa. So you walk around it. And we'll see that in some other religious contexts. When we study Islam, much later on in the semester, when pilgrims go to Mecca, they circumambulate the Kaaba, which is this central shrine in the holy city of Mecca, the birthplace of Islam. So this idea of circumambulating holy sites is something that we can find in multiple religious traditions. This is one of the oldest surviving stupas in the world. This one is called the Great Stupa of Sanchi, and it's located here in central India. This was built by Ashoka, the Mauryan emperor who converted to Buddhism and helped to really transform Buddhism from this kind of religious dissident movement to the religion that we know today. The stupa that we see here in this image has been restored by modern archaeologists and historical preservation techniques. It did collapse into disuse. And during British rule over India, which we talked about in our study of Hinduism, British archaeologists discovered the site and excavated it, and they actually removed the holy relics that were contained in it, and they took it back to Britain. Those holy relics have since been returned to India, but they're no longer contained inside the Great Stupa itself. They're kept in a separate facility for safekeeping. But the tradition is that the relics that were contained in this Great Stupa belong to members of the original Sangha, the original disciples of the Buddha himself. Here's another ancient stupa, and this one's in much worse condition. This is the Piprawa stupa, and the significant thing about this one is that this stupa was built to contain relics of the Buddha himself. So we know very little about the historical Buddha, but if we are to believe the engravings on the ashes that were found within this stupa, these are supposed to be a portion of the actual ashes of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha himself. After the Buddha died, and we talked about his death at the age of 80 in my last lecture, he was cremated and his ashes were divided into 8 portions. And those 8 portions were installed at various stupas throughout northern India. So this is just one of the 8 portions, but this is the only portion that has been discovered. And the thinking is that this portion originally belonged to the Shakya people, that the Buddha had been a prince of the Shakya people. So these ashes once belonged to the Buddha's people. So with the excavations and discovery around this stupa, it has become an important pilgrimage site for Buddhists. But as I mentioned in my first lecture, and as we saw on the map at the beginning of this lecture, Buddhism in India itself, the birthplace of Buddhism, largely dies out. Buddhism is reabsorbed by Hinduism with all its diversity, In fact, Hindus would come to regard the Buddha as an avatar of Vishnu, something that Buddhists themselves reject, and they do not believe this. They know the Buddha was not an avatar of Vishnu, but that's what Hindus will say about Buddhism. And so they, in essence, reabsorbed it into all the diverse methods and schools of thought within Hinduism itself. Then you also have the arrival of various outside invaders, whether it's Turkic Muslims from the West or Mongols or others who would come. And these stupas, when they were originally built, probably also contained jewels and other various valuable items. And so they would have been the targets of plunder by various kingdoms and invaders or just, criminals. And if you don't have a Buddhist ruler to restore these stupas, then they can fall into disuse over the centuries. There was also strong opposition to Buddhism on the part of Hindus. Ashoka had, yes, become a Buddhist, and he really tried to promote Buddhism. But remember that Buddhism rejects the caste system. It rejects the authority of the Brahmin priests. It rejects the authority of the Vedas. So if you're a Hindu, you're saying, this is heresy, right? What are you talking about? The Vedas are divine. They are the source of all knowledge. They are sacred. I am a Brahmin priest. I have authority over these other castes, and Buddhism is saying to reject all of that. So there was violent opposition to Buddhism on the part of Hindus. You also had rival ascetic movements like the Jains, who considered their teacher Mahavira greater than the Buddha. In fact, it's still said today by some Jains that Buddhism is basically based off of their religion. It's their ideas, and that the story of the Buddha is based off the story of Mahavira. So there's all these rival traditions, and it succeeded in basically defeating Buddhism in India. However, Buddhism would thrive to the east. It would take root in places like Burma or Myanmar and spread into China, into Korea and Japan, and that's the real heartland of Buddhism today. So it survives elsewhere, but it really dies out in India itself. I'm going to skip over this video clip because I'm sure YouTube is just going to give me a copyright violation, but it was just about the excavations of the Piprala stupa. So speaking of relics and Buddhist shrines, there's an important one back on the island of Sri Lanka. We already know that Sri Lanka is important because Ashoka sent his monk son Mahinda there, that he brought Buddhism there, and that the Buddhists in Sri Lanka later wrote the Tripitaka, the text that we talked about at the beginning of the lecture today. But tradition says that in the 4th century, a relic of the Buddha himself, a surviving tooth of the Buddha, was transported to Sri Lanka, and it was enshrined in the capital city of Kandy, where a great temple was built. So today, the holiest Buddhist site in Sri Lanka is the Temple of the Tooth in the city of Kandy. And the only people who have access to that holy relic, a relic of the Buddha himself, are the monks who oversee that temple. But there's one day of the year where a festival takes place. And when the Perahera festival takes place, the relic is removed from the temple, placed on the back of a royal elephant, and there is a wild festive parade through the streets around the temple, which allows ordinary folks to be in the presence of the sacred relic. So that happens once a year. And so you can be outside, standing there as the tooth relic passes by in the back of an elephant, and thus receive the karmic blessings of being in the presence of the tooth. So Sri Lanka has all these very significant connections to Buddhism. The presence of the tooth relic, I will say that there are other tooths that are said to have belonged to the Buddha as well in some other places. There's one in Singapore, for example. But Sri Lanka itself is the oldest continually Buddhist country in the world. So although Buddhism began in India, it basically dies out in India. So the country where Buddhism survives the longest is Sri Lanka, a history that goes back to the 3rd century BCE, and there's a lot of prestige with that. Right? And the form that dominates in Sri Lanka is Theravada Buddhism. Here's some images of the sacred temple of the tooth in Kandy in Sri Lanka. This is the interior, and the tooth relic is kept in a golden reliquary behind these curtains, and here you can see the ivory tusks of elephants. I hope that those elephants died of old age and weren't killed for those. And here you can see the doors to the sacred chamber with the curtain drawn back. And there you can see the golden reliquary that actually contains the tooth. So you don't get to actually see the tooth inside of it, but it's contained in this reliquary. And this is what is removed and placed on the back of the elephants during the annual Perahera festival. And there you can see some images of it. So we have all these festive lights and even, people spinning plates and fire breathers and all kinds of festive things. But this is the centerpiece of it all. This is the tooth relic on the back of the elephant. And there you can see the crowds gathered to watch as the procession goes by. So you get to have a kind of encounter with this sacred relic of the Buddha himself. So Theravada Buddhism, as we've established, has a very narrow, restrictive idea about who can achieve nirvana. That leaves a lot of people unable to ever hope for nirvana. So instead, they have to just hope for the accumulation of good karma in order to improve their next karmic rebirth, right? That their next reincarnation will put them in a good enough place where they can pursue a life as a monk in order to achieve nirvana. So for the vast majority of Theravada Buddhists, and certainly all women, they live according to certain moral ethical precepts and engage in certain practices that are believed to be beneficial to them. The 5 core practices, precepts of the Theravada laity, that is the non-monks, are don't kill, so specifically don't commit murder. And there are some various interpretations of this as to whether or not that requires vegetarianism, for example, if you can't kill any animal. And some people would certainly understand it that way, but for others, a more narrow focus about not killing human beings, not committing murder. This also raises interesting questions about the legality of warfare, and those things have been dealt with, and they arrive at justifications for killing in war on the basis of necessity and all these various other factors. Don't steal. Don't commit sexual immorality, fornication, adultery, so forth. No wrong speech, so avoid lying, gossip, backbiting, slander, hate speech, all of those things, and avoid intoxicants. So ideally, stay away from alcohol and drugs. Some people would even include tobacco. Now, does this mean that everyone who is a Theravada Buddhist actually rigorously adheres to these? No. And you can find that in all religious traditions, right? If we were to look and say, well, what does the Bible say Christians are supposed to do and behave like? And then look at whether Christians actually act that way. Do they always turn the other cheek, right? Do they avoid premarital sex, all those types of things? We say no, right? People who identify as Christians and go to church. And so there's always a kind of negotiation. So the same thing is going on here. And it doesn't negate them from being a Buddhist because they cursed and had wine with dinner or something like that, right? Now, meditation is a practice that, of course, any Buddhist could engage in. But in the Theravada tradition, meditation is principally an activity for monks, not for the laity. That's part of the monastic life. And when we think of Buddhism here in the United States, and American Buddhism has done this, we've really popularized meditation, like things like mindfulness meditation. But in the Theravada tradition, that's typically something for monks, not for the laity. So you can do it, there's no rule against it, but it's something for the monks. Then we have this interesting activity referred to as Buddha Puja. So we learned this word puja in our study of Hinduism. It basically means worship. And according to Theravada belief, when the Buddha achieved parinirvana, after he died, he's like a candle being extinguished, right? The skandhas are extinguished, so he doesn't exist. He's not a deity out there that you can worship and who's going to respond to you. So why are people engaged in Buddha Puja, which are basically acts of worship, of veneration of Buddhist images, of bowing and making offerings to Buddhist statues? The justification is that it's not about a being receiving offerings. It's actually about the person doing the offerings. It's about cultivating emulation of the Buddha, of focusing the mind on the Dharma, and sort of, immediate psychological effects on the Buddhists themselves. However, aside from that justification, it seems to me that this is a kind of product of syncretism, right? That we can see various acts of worship to various different deities and so many different indigenous religions and so many religions around the world, that this is probably just a kind of Buddhist adaptation of pre-Buddhist theistic religious practices, right? As if there's a kind of natural impulse of human beings to want to engage in some act of worship. So it's simply redirected towards the person of the Buddha and of other revered figures. In addition to that, we have various other activities that are designed to bring about good karma or accumulate merit, as it's sometimes described. One of those we mentioned earlier, which is to give food, to give alms to the monks. So if you live in a village beside a monastery and you're cooking dinner, right, you take a portion of that food and you go and you donate it to the monks who are standing by, right, with their begging bowls. That's what they live off of. That's very beneficial to you. If you live in Sri Lanka, you of course celebrate the Perahera festival, but there are other universal Buddhist festivals, such as the Buddha's birthday. The Buddha's birthday occurs on the full moon of the second month of the Indian calendar, which roughly corresponds to late spring, early summer every year. But again, it's not on a date, it's on the day of the full moon. So it's not something for each year. So by participating in these things, the idea is that you are accumulating good karma. By living according to these precepts, you're helping to live a good life in order to improve your future reincarnation, in hopes that perhaps then you'll be able to pursue liberation from samsara. Here we see some photographs of people, particularly women, donating food to monks. So the monks here have gathered in their saffron robes with their begging bowls, and they've lined up and they're receiving the various offerings. So these women are accumulating good karma by doing so. Obviously, the precept of not killing lends itself naturally to vegetarianism, but vegetarianism is not required even for the monks. In fact, the rule in the Vinaya is that the monks may eat, and gratefully, whatever is donated to them. So if they're donating, bread and rice and some vegetables, that's fine. But if they were to also donate, let's say, some chicken, the monks are permitted to eat that. Right? The monks are not permitted to go and kill a chicken in order to eat it, but if someone else donates to them, they can eat it. It is permissible to them. And no, they don't get a choice. They can't put an order in for what they want for dinner. They have to accept whatever is given to them. And that's what they live off of. So within the system of Theravada Buddhism, are there any gods and goddesses? We know that in Hinduism, there's tons. There's an old saying that there's 330 million Hindu gods and goddesses. That's a hyperbolic, exaggeration. But yeah, there's a lot of gods and goddesses. And here comes Buddhism as this reaction against Hinduism. Did it say that all the gods and goddesses don't exist? Well, not exactly. So in Buddhism, gods and goddesses are not the focus of a Buddhist activities. The general view is that, okay, gods and goddesses exist in samsara, just like human beings and animals exist, right? They're part of this world. Yeah, there might be a god of rain who's responsible for the rains that are falling right now. There might be a god associated with agriculture, but those are all things related to this world. And the goal in Buddhism is to escape this world, is to escape samsara. So leave the cycle of animals and humans and gods and goddesses, all that stuff behind, and to try to escape it. So in Theravada Buddhism, there's an openness to the fact that, okay, in Myanmar, they believe that these gods exist. Okay, fine. They can continue to exist. They're part of this world. But in Buddhism, our goal is not to worship those gods. Our goal is to achieve liberation from samsara. So if you're a lay Buddhist and you have a farm, yeah, maybe you go and you make offerings to the local rice deity. Like in Japan, there's a deity called Inari, and he's associated with rice and agriculture and prosperity. So yeah, maybe you go and you make an offering to Inari in hopes that that deity will benefit your farm. But in terms of your spiritual destination, Inari is irrelevant. You want to achieve liberation from samsara. Okay, so there's room for deities, but they're not the focus of Theravada Buddhism in particular. When we get to Mahayana Buddhism on Monday, we'll see something that looks increasingly like Buddhist deities who can help you and who will help you get liberated from samsara. But that's not a part of the Theravada tradition, this old traditional form. The last thing I want to leave you with is a little bit of a preview for our discussion next time. So there are Buddhists who, observing the methods, the teachings, the ways of the Theravada Buddhists, saw something wrong with that approach. They said, in Theravada Buddhism, you're just concerned with your own liberation, right? You go and you take the monastic vows and you live according to these rules in the monastic community in hopes that you will be liberated. That's kind of selfish, right? You're leaving all other sentient beings behind who are suffering in samsara. And the Buddha talked about not having any hatred, right? And not having any desire. He cultivated the idea of compassion and empathy for others. So shouldn't you be concerned with the liberation of other sentient beings and their suffering before your own? So that idea, that extra emphasis on compassion, lies at the heart of another sect of Buddhism called Mahayana. And the word Mahayana means greater approach, greater method, greater vehicle. And Mahayana Buddhists would say, okay, Theravada is fine, but it's an inferior form of Buddhism. They would even describe it as Hinayana, the lesser approach. And it's sort of like, all right, that's Buddhism 101. But the real superior form of Buddhism is our form, in which you're striving to help all others before you worry about your own liberation. And it's this form of Buddhism which is far more flexible, far more adaptable to different cultures and changes in time, and which is the largest branch of Buddhism in the world. About 65% of all Buddhists in the world are Mahayana Buddhists, not Theravada Buddhists. Okay, so that's what we'll be studying on Monday. And Mahayana Buddhism has a number of different denominations, sort of like Protestant Christianity. You've got different denominations, the Lutherans and the Presbyterians and the Anglicans and so on and so forth. The same goes for Mahayana Buddhism. One school or sect or denomination of Mahayana is Zen Buddhism. So in preparation for our discussion of Zen, please read the document, How to Meditate Zazen. Zazen is the core meditation activity of the Zen denomination of Mahayana Buddhism. All right? So that concludes my lecture on Buddhism today. I hope you have a great weekend. Stay dry, stay safe and healthy, and I will see you back here on Monday.